Hi, this is Matt McCormick at the Department of Philosophy, California State University, Sacramento. There's my email address and my course website page. And this is one of the first lectures that we're going to have for my online critical thinking course. And this one's titled The Basics of Argument. All right, so we've got a number of important concepts to lay out and work out some basics on today. So what does it mean to say something's true? A sentence is true if what it expresses matches or corresponds to what is the case in the world. That's different than belief we're going to see in a minute. For example, the earth is flat is a false sentence. The earth is spherical is a true sentence. And we can say a few more things about what it means to say something's true. The truth is objective. That is, it doesn't depend on what people think or what they believe. The truth is just what it is, no matter what we think. It's mind independent. It remains what it is, whether we form beliefs about it or not, even if there was no one with a mind to think about it. So imagine that there was a consciousness plague that wiped out everybody in the universe, every conscious mind in the universe tomorrow. Would it still be true that the earth is round or that 2 + 2 = 4? Yes, those things would stay the same. So facts are outside of the mind, truths are outside of the mind. They don't depend upon beliefs. So what about this idea that sometimes people say something like, well, something's true for them? Some people believe things like the earth is flat or astrological forecasts work. That is, they believe that these false sentences were in fact true. So does it make sense to say, was it true for them that the earth was flat? Does that make sense? Well, no. Using truth this way, I'm going to maintain, is unintelligible. Here's why. Can we say true for them instead of just straight true, objectively true? Well, belief and truth are distinct. And here's what we mean. When a person S believes some sentence, then S takes it to be true. S assents to that sentence. S believes that it's true. So this woman thinks that vaccines cause autism. But the facts about the matter, whether or not the sentence actually is true, is independent from whether or not she believes it. So the facts out there in the world are distinct from what she believes. Her belief can diverge from or deviate from the truth. So it doesn't mean making sense to say true for her. What we mean is she believes it. And it's either true or it's false. And in this case, it's false. We know it's false, but she doesn't know about it yet. She hasn't seen all the evidence. She hasn't reflected on it. So she's got a belief that diverts from the truth or deviates from the truth. Okay, so we can say some more here. Truth or mere belief. Believing something doesn't make it true. If one person believes that the earth is flat, or a Pikachu, or a Pokemon for that matter, and another person believes that the earth is round, they both take different things to be true. Okay, so they've got different conceptions of reality in their minds, different pictures or different models of reality. But they both can't be true. Only one of them's right and the other one's mistaken. What they both believe can't be true because what each one believes rules out or is incompatible with the other one believes. Okay, so both claims can't be consistent with each other. One of them's got to be wrong. And in fact, what settles the matter or what resolves the conflict is reality. So if what the picture of reality that you have in mind corresponds to or matches up with reality, in this case the round earth, then you've got the correct picture of the world. But if your picture of the world doesn't map on reality, then you have an incorrect picture of the world, and what you believe is incompatible with what somebody else believes when they believe something's true. So this brings us to something we're going to call the correspondence principle. When sentences are true, what they say corresponds with the facts or the way the world actually is. Every sentence is either true or false, not both. And there's a number of other claims we can say about the basic components of knowledge here. So let's start with belief. To believe a claim is to assent to it, just like our friend who believes about vaccinations, or to have an attitude towards it such that you think it's true. So when you think something's true, then you assent to it. Now, whether or not that's reality is another matter, like this guy who's had too much wine to drink. It may or may not be true, but to believe it is to think that it is. Okay, so when you believe something, you've got it in your mind and you picture it as if it's true, but in fact, reality is a different matter. Beliefs are subjective because they depend upon an individual to possess them. You can't have beliefs floating around out there without minds, without individuals thinking them. Beliefs are mind dependent, that is, they depend on us, and there are no beliefs without minds in the world. And that makes it very different from truth in the ways we saw before, because truth is objective and mind independent. Now, furthermore, and you may have already figured this out, but when philosophers or critical reasoners use the term belief, we're using it very broadly. All claims that a person would agree to, whether they're trivial or momentous. Sometimes when people say something like, well, what are my beliefs, or what are your beliefs, what they mean is, what are your big, important philosophical views, or what are your religious views, or something like that. And that's not what we mean. We mean even trivial things like, February follows January. You believe that. The chair I'm sitting on is not made of cheese. You probably believe that. If the sun is shining, then it's daytime. You believe that too. Those are minor, trivial matters. They're still part of your beliefs. So we're going to talk about your whole belief structure, including the big ones, including the trivial ones. Now, what can we say about rational belief? Well, there's three different attitudes that you can take towards a proposition when you get confronted with it. If your evidence supports the proposition and it's complete enough to draw a conclusion, then that's a case where you'll believe this claim that you get confronted with somebody who's trying to get you to sign on. Under what circumstances should you disbelieve something? Well, if your evidence on the whole is against it, and you've got enough evidence that justifies your drawing a conclusion, then you should disbelieve it. But of course, there's a third option here. If your evidence is not complete or your evidence is neutral with regard to the claim, then you should suspend judgment. So you've got these three possible attitudes you can take towards something. And where you come down on this, on these three attitudes, believing, disbelieving, or suspending judgment will depend upon the quality and quantity of evidence you have. And we can also say this now, and this is a really foundational, really important claim. Here's one of the bedrock principles of critical reasoning. And it takes a minute to think this through. The strength of your conviction should be proportional to your evidence. The stronger your evidence for a proposition is, the stronger your belief in it should be. And that's to say, the more compelling, the more powerful, the more complete, the better quality, the more quantity of evidence you have in favor of something, then you should not just believe it, but believe it strongly. You should have a strong conviction that it's true. There's some things you believe with less conviction, and there's things you believe with more conviction. That's fine. And the way that ought to pan out is your evidence ought to match up there. So if you've got mild evidence in favor, then you believe it. If you've got really compelling, powerful evidence in favor, then you really ought to believe it. And we'll consider some more examples like that here shortly. Okay, now let's consider another really important concept for our course, and this is the idea of fallibilism. I want to talk about an ancient Greek astronomer named Ptolemy. Ptolemy was, by any account, a genius. He's one of the greatest minds in human history. And Ptolemy had spent a vast amount of time compiling evidence and considering the question of what's the configuration of the sun and the earth and the stars and the planets in the universe. And he had a large body of the best available evidence for this conclusion: the sun orbits the earth. That is, he believes something false. The sun doesn't orbit the earth orbits the sun. The sun's at the center and the earth goes around it. But Ptolemy had it backwards. He thought it went this way. He thought the earth was in the middle and the sun went around the outside. Now, to an ancient Greek astronomer who doesn't have available to him all the modern astronomy devices, telescopes, the Hubble telescope, and all the other tools and evidence that you've got available to him, this, in fact, was probably a reasonable conclusion. Ptolemy couldn't have known any better. We can hardly hold Ptolemy at fault for this. We can't say, well, that was stupid, Ptolemy. Why would you draw that conclusion? Well, he drew that conclusion because all of the best evidence that was available suggested that that was true, and there wasn't any better evidence that he could have acquired. You can't demand of him that he travel forward in time 2,000 years to get the evidence that you have. In fact, he had spent more time thinking about this and had reviewed and reflected this topic and studied it more than you have. So by any account, he had done more of his due diligence on researching the question than you have. And he drew a conclusion, the best conclusion available with his information. He just got it wrong. So the Ptolemy example shows us that you've got to separate something. You've got to separate justification from false and true. That is, we're going to adopt this principle. We're going to adopt the principle of fallibilism, and we're going to say a belief can be reasonable, it can be rational or justified, but it still be false. You can draw the correct conclusion given all your information, but get it wrong. We're going to separate justification from truth. That's a really important distinction. So consider this example. What's your justification, for example, for thinking that the earth is spherical? Well, you've got a bunch of justification here in yellow. Your geography professor said it, your mom and dad said it, people you trust said it, you've got textbooks that said it, maybe you've downloaded Google Earth and you've looked at things on Google Earth. You know from reading and from history, from the internet, that John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. Maybe you went on vacation to Australia last year and you flew around the Earth. So you've got a lot of information, a lot of justification. And also, by the way, justification that Ptolemy didn't have. But you've got all that information, and all that justification lends support to your drawing the conclusion that the earth is spherical. Now, also, I want to make sure I'm not confusing matters here, because Ptolemy's idea was that the earth orbits the sun. That's one claim. And now we're talking about a different claim about whether the earth is shaped like a ball or whether it's flat and round like a pancake. All right, so a person's justification for a claim P is the set of reasons, the other beliefs, or the matters that she takes to support or imply P. So you have a lot of justification for this conclusion. Now, another famous conclusion or famous principle here, a famous definition that we can now put together is this notion that knowledge is JTB. This is an ancient notion that comes to us all the way from Plato. And the idea is that in order to have knowledge, knowledge is a special kind of belief. You have knowledge when you have a justified true belief. So the intersection of truths with the intersection of things that are justified for you to believe, with the intersection of things that you do in fact believe, that little region there in the center, that's knowledge. So knowledge is JTB. And the thing is, you've got these other cases, these other examples in your life. You might believe something and it's true, but you don't have any justification for it. So maybe you just guessed, or maybe you just you got it from some unreliable source or something like that. Well, that's not justification. You got lucky in this case. What about if you believe it and it's not true? Well, even if you got justification for it, it's not knowledge. So Ptolemy, for instance, believed, and he was justified in thinking that the Earth orbit, or the Sun orbits the Earth, but it wasn't knowledge because it wasn't true. So we can say of Ptolemy that he had a justified false belief, but we say of you that you have a justified true belief that the Earth orbits the Sun. Now, what about a case where something's justified, but you don't believe it? Well, that's not knowledge either. And what would be a case like that? Well, there are some implications of things you know. You've got some ideas, some beliefs you already possess, and that were you to put them together, you could see that they imply some conclusion. But you haven't reflected on that, and you don't believe it yet, you don't see it yet. So in that kind of case, we don't say that's knowledge because you don't believe it. All right, now next, a very important concept that we've got to work out for this class, and this is also the topic of your quiz this week, is the notion of consistency. And here's what we mean by consistency. If one claim is true, that is, if one claim correctly describes reality, then it rules out a bunch of other claims as false. So we've already seen this example. The earth is round implies that the earth is flat is false. They both can't be true. So one of these precludes the other. Now what about this case? So a set of sentences is consistent. Now here's our definition. If it's possible for all of them to be true at the same time. And I like this M.C. Escher picture, because these pictures throw this consistency switch circuit breaker in our brains. You look at that and you realize that what the picture's describing is not a consistent state of affairs. It's not a coherent state of affairs. So here's a visual representation of something that's inconsistent. It's not possible for that cube to be really configured the way it looks to be configured. It's an optical illusion. A set of sentences is inconsistent if it's not possible possible for all of them to be true at the same time. Now, you're already an expert at this. You're already very good at making this distinction. You do it all the time. You've done it since you were a little kid. In fact, if you've got kids, if you've got a 2-year-old in the house, your 2-year-old has been giving you grief about this all the time, because they will call you out on every single one of these things you get right or get wrong. The kid will go, well, but you said, and they're calling you out for being inconsistent now, or allegedly being inconsistent for something you said now compared to what you said before. That is, if you promise to take them for ice cream after going to the doctor, they will lock that away in their heads and they will remember it. And if you don't do it, they will say, Mommy is being inconsistent. Mommy said one thing and she said she was going to do this. She said that the world was going to be this way and the world is not that way, and that's Mommy's fault. Okay, so here's an example. Here's an inconsistent pair. This is obvious. Des Moines is in Iowa is not consistent with Des Moines is in Connecticut. And let's just assume for the moment that there's not a city named Des Moines in Connecticut. That is, we know that Des Moines is the capital of Iowa, and that's not consistent with Des Moines being in Connecticut. Those two are incompatible. One sentence as being true rules out other descriptions that don't match up with it. So when we consider what one sentence says, there are some other sentences that are incompatible with it that are ruled out by it. Okay, so here's another example. Inconsistent: if I live in Sacramento full-time, then it's not true that I live in Paris. But these two are consistent. I live in Sacramento and I live in California are consistent. There's nothing incompatible about those two. And the same for I live in Sacramento is consistent with 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with water. There's nothing about those that are inconsistent. Now, what about these two? I'm a fish, and I have lungs and breathe air. Are those consistent or inconsistent? Those are inconsistent. You can't have both. The definition of being a fish is that you don't breathe air and you don't have lungs as such, so those are inconsistent. What about this example? Aliens from Mutara all weigh more than 100 kilograms. Shriek, an alien from Mutara, weighs 101 kilograms. So first off, we can say that these two are consistent. And what this example also shows us is that we can have two sentences be false but consistent. That is to say, consistency and truth are different matters. So when I'm asking you, or when a logician or a philosopher or critical reasoner is asking you, are these sentences consistent? We're not asking, are they true? They might both be false. Both of these are false. I just made them up. So we're describing, in this case, a fictional scenario. And fictional scenarios can be logically internally consistent or inconsistent. So if we had said, Shriek, an alien from Mutara weighs 10 kilograms, that would be inconsistent with the previous sentence. So we're describing a fictional scenario where the two things can't both be part of that logically consistent scenario. So to emphasize here, consistency is not, asking for consistency is not asking the same for, are they true? So don't look at a quiz question, for example, and say, oh, well, that's true, so they're consistent. They might be true, they might be false, they might both be true, they might both be false, but whether or not they're consistent is a different question. Does the truth of one rule out the truth of another one? That's what's being asked for about when we're trying to figure out whether or not they're consistent. Okay, so what about Sacramento is in California and California is in the United States? Are those inconsistent or consistent? Those are obviously consistent, good and well they are. In fact, they're both true. What about Barack Obama was the 44th American president. Miley Cyrus was the 44th American president. Consistent or inconsistent? Nightmare or fantasy? No, neither. It's certainly a nightmare. And those two are inconsistent. They both can't be true. Now, I suppose Miley Cyrus might become the 48th president. God, let's hope that doesn't happen. But it could happen, and those two would be consistent. But in this case, we've said that Obama's the 44th and Cyrus is the 44th, and they can't both be the 44th. It's a singular, unique position. Now, what about roses are red and violets are blue? Those are consistent. What about the Earth orbits the Sun and Pluto orbits the Sun? And no comment on the controversy about Pluto's being a planet. Pluto is not a planet now, but those two are consistent. And what they say is, they say something that what one says doesn't rule out what the other one says. What about there are no humans on the moon and Arnold Schwarzenegger, a human, is on the moon? Consistent or inconsistent? Those are inconsistent because what they say, they both can't be right. One says there's no humans on the moon, the other one says there are humans on the moon. So it can't both be right. What about Mike is a bachelor and Mike is married? I don't need to know Mike. I don't need to know anything else. I can say that those are inconsistent because bachelor, the definition of bachelor means an unmarried adult human male, and that rules out Mike's being married. What about these two? Let's get right into the controversial religious material. The universe is 6,000 years old, so take the young Earth creationism story. Or the universe is 13.7 billion years old. Takes the account of the history of the universe we get from physics and astronomy. Are those consistent or inconsistent? Now, lots of people, and notice I'm being really precise here, lots of people want to say, oh, well, religion and science, they're compatible. Well, I'm not asking you that. Look at the words here. I've said these two sentences. The universe is 6,000 years old, and the universe is 3.7 billion years old. I'm not asking about whether or not science and religion are compatible. I'm asking whether those two sentences are compatible. And the answer is they're inconsistent. What about everyone in the building is a female, Jim is in the building, and he is a male? Those are inconsistent. What about these three? Now things are going to get more complicated. You got to think these through. Here's three sentences. And one point here is that we can have larger sets of sentences and ask of them whether they're consistent or inconsistent. They don't just have to be two of them. Here's three. If the door is locked, then this door is closed. So there's a hypothetical or conditional sentence. It says if one thing's true, then another's true. And we also know that the door is locked from 2. So imagine the scenario we're describing. And we know from 3 that the door is closed. Can all of those be true at the same time? Yeah, those are exactly what are true at the same time. If 1's true and 2 is true, then 3 has to be true. So those, in fact, are logically consistent. Okay, harder cases. All sea mammals have a protective layer of blubber. Professor McCormick has a protective layer of blubber, and he's not a sea mammal. All right, so consistent or inconsistent? And again, you've got to pay close attention to what's being said. Oh, notice he's wearing the same clothes in both of these. No, I got a different shirt on, same jacket. Now, are they consistent or inconsistent? You should see that these are consistent. And the reason they might look like they're not is if you're confused about what one says. One says all sea mammals have a protective layer of blubber. It doesn't say all things with a protective layer of blubber are sea mammals. If it had said that, then that would be inconsistent with 2. But given what it does say, these two are consistent. You can have more than just sea mammals having protective layers of blubber. All right. Now, what about smokers get cancer at a higher rate than non-smokers? And this is a much harder example. Smith was a smoker, but he never got cancer. Okay, so the first one says smokers get cancer at a higher rate than non-smokers. So this is about percentages and statistics. And the second says Smith was a smoker, but he never got cancer. Are those consistent or inconsistent? And those two are consistent. Why? Well, one just says that the rates are elevated amongst smokers versus non-smokers. It doesn't say all of them get cancer. If one had said every single smoker gets cancer, and then Smith was a smoker, but he didn't get cancer, they'd be inconsistent. But it doesn't say that, and that's a confusion about what cause means here. We know that smoking causes cancer, but that doesn't mean that every single person who smokes gets cancer. And what one means doesn't mean something inconsistent with 2. All right, so a few more, and you'll be ready to tackle the quiz. Former soldiers often have psychological problems. Jones has psychological problems, and he's not a former soldier. Are those consistent or inconsistent? Well, read carefully. Former soldiers often have psychological problems. Does it say anything about former soldiers, or people who aren't soldiers, or other people with other psychological problems? No, it doesn't say anything about them. It just says this group, former soldiers, often, it doesn't say all of them, it says often have psychological problems. So Jones's problem is consistent with the first sentence. Okay, now a few more ideas, a few more concepts before we leave this lecture for today. We're going to be dealing with arguments this semester. What's an argument? An argument is a set of reasons or premises and a conclusion. So here's an example. 1 is a premise, 2 is a premise, and 3 is the conclusion. And we're going to be reconstructing them in this style. We're going to give them numbers for the premises, we're going to draw a line, and then have the conclusion. Now that's not going to have any impact on lots of people because of this problem that you know so well. that was a very well laid out rational point, but I will still hold to my emotional opinion based on no facts or evidence. So you can go to hell. You know lots of those examples. Now, what we're more interested in is trying to be reasonable. We're interested in successful arguments. A successful argument is a set of premises that are true, and when we apply the canons of inductive or deductive logic to them, and you are going to get very good at doing that. That sounds awesome. That sounds very badass, doesn't it? You're going to apply the canons of inductive and deductive logic to arguments. When we apply those logic to the premises, and the premises logically imply that the conclusion is true, that's a successful argument. Okay, so that's one of our definitions and a very important concept. You need to get clear on that one and review that before you take the quiz and before we move on in this course. Now, a related notion here is rationality. If a person considers an argument, and if she believes that the premises are true, and she recognizes that premises logically imply the conclusion, then she's rationally committed to accept the conclusion as true. She shouldn't just ignore it and believe what she's emotionally committed to. If she's reasonable, she ought to accept that conclusion, whether she likes it or not. Failing to accept the conclusion in this case would be irrational. So that's where I'm going to draw the line between rational and irrational conduct in our cognitive affairs. All right, so a summary of the big concepts we've dealt with here, a very rough and ready kind of set of highlights for the things you need to know for the quiz. And there's also going to be, and I will share this with you, there's going to be a Google Doc that has a long list of review questions from this lecture that you should go through and answer for your own purposes in preparation for taking the quiz. Okay, so we've talked about truth, belief, rational belief, fallibilism, justification. We've discovered that knowledge, according to the ancient account, is JTB, justified true belief. We've talked about consistency, and that's your first quiz. We've talked about successful arguments.